Family, how's everybody doing? I pray everybody's doing well. Listen, I want to deal with the history of the Republican Party. I've seen many posts on social media, especially Facebook. Every time the issue of slavery is brought up, many white conservatives like to talk about how the Democratic Party was the party of slavery and Jim Crow, which they were. But they do not like to discuss the ugly history of the Republican Party. So listen, this is what this video is about today. First thing I want to do is pray. Again, Father, I thank you for this platform, and I pray, Lord, that information that is discussed on today would be both informative and thought-provoking. This I pray in Jesus' name. So I'm going to go ahead and
Today's
start the video.
Republican Party opposes big government. It's culturally conservative. Its demographic support is strongest among white voters, and it usually dominates elections in the South. The party's 2016 presidential nominee has been heavily criticized for inciting racial tensions. But things weren't always this way. Over the past 160 years or so, the party has undergone a remarkable transformation from the party of Abraham Lincoln to the party of Donald Trump. To understand how the GOP got this way, you have to go back to when it first came into existence in 1854, just 7 years before the Civil War. There are two parties at this point, the Whigs and the Democrats. America is quickly expanding westward, and there's an intense debate over whether or not new states should permit slavery. The Democratic Party, with strong support in the South, has become increasingly pro-slavery. But the Whigs are divided on the issue. Their northern supporters are really afraid that the growing number of slave states would have too much political influence, which they feared could really hurt free white workers economically. So in 1854, the country is debating whether or not the territories of Kansas and Nebraska should allow slavery. The Whigs can't agree, and the party ends up collapsing. The former Whigs in the North form a new party that will fight against letting slavery expand any further. They call it the Republican Party. By 1860, the Republican Party has become increasingly powerful in the North, enough so that a little-known Republican named Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. Even though Lincoln promises he won't interfere with slavery in states that already have it, he and his party are still too anti-slavery for the South to tolerate. So
Close attention to what the narrator just said about Lincoln, okay?
11 southern states secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The northern states decide to fight to keep the Union together, and the Civil War ensues. The result is a northern victory and the
They fought to keep the Union together. Again, Lincoln's main objective was to maintain the Union. He was not really so much concerned about the freedom of black people in the southern states.
abolition of slavery nationwide. After the war, Republicans begin fighting to ensure that recently freed slaves in the South have their rights. A year after Lincoln's assassination, the party passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They fight to make sure that black men have the same right to vote with new laws and constitutional amendments. But something had happened during the Civil War that began changing the
Pay close attention what the narrator is getting ready to say now. There was a change.
young Republican Party. Government spending during the war made many northern businessmen really rich.
Really rich, and family, it's no coincidence today that the Republican Party is the party of big business as well as white conservatives, racists, and bigots.
Gradually, these wealthy financiers and industrialists start taking more and more of a leadership role in the Republican Party. They want to hold on to power, and they don't think that fighting for black rights in a mostly white country is the best way to do that.
Get that fighting for blacks is the best way to reach their agenda. And this is one of the things that white conservatives, even black conservatives, do not mention.
Meanwhile, the South is resisting these new racial reforms, often violently. And most white Republican voters and leaders now feel that they've done enough for black citizens in the South.
They feel they've done enough for black citizens. And also something I want to mention, it was mostly radical Republicans like one of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, that was actually fighting for the rights of black people even after slavery. But many of them died off.
And it's time to emphasize other issues. So in 1870, the party basically gives up on reforming the South.
They gave up on reforming the South.
deciding instead to leave it to its own devices. The region becomes politically
When they left it to their own devices, in came the black codes, Jim Crow segregation, and the terrorist Ku Klux Klan.
dominated by white Democrats. Fast forward to the new century.
Notice he said white Democrats. Specifically, they were white Southern Democrats.
By the 1920s, the Republican Party has become essentially the party of big business. This works out quite well for them as the economy is booming, but not so well when the economy crashes in 1929 and the Great Depression begins. Franklin D. Roosevelt and other Democrats are swept into power and begin dramatically expanding the size and role of the federal government in an attempt to fight the Depression and better provide for Americans.
And family, it's important to note this is when black people, little by little, begin to gravitate to the Democratic Party, and it was because of the policies of the Democratic president.
Republicans oppose this rapid expansion, defining themselves as opposition to big government, an identity that the party still holds today. Going into the 50s and 60s, race and the South returned to the forefront of national politics, with the civil rights movement attempting to end segregation and ensure blacks truly have the right to vote. The civil rights debate isn't a purely partisan issue. It's more of a regional issue, with Northerners from both parties supporting it and Southerners from both parties opposing it.
Some from both parties were against it. Pay close attention to that. Civil rights.
Then, in 1964, it's Democratic President Lyndon Johnson who signs the Civil Rights Act into law. And it's Republican presidential nominee Barry Goldwater who opposes it, arguing
Republican Barry Goldwater. Republican Barry Goldwater opposed it. You don't hear white conservatives and even black conservatives mention old Goldwater.
that it expands government power too much. A massive switch-up takes place. Black
They will never admit the switch up, which is the switch up of ideology between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's important that you do your own research, family.
voters, some of whom had already been shifting from the Republican Party, convert almost entirely to their new advocates, the Democrats. The white voters in the South, who had been staunch Democrats, start to really resent the big government interference here.
Resented big government interference. Mainly, they interfered with their way of life, which was Jim Crow, white supremacy, discrimination, racism, etc.
And in other matters like abortion rights and school prayer. Over the next 3 decades, whites in the South switch to the GOP, which makes the South an overwhelming
The switch. Pay close attention to the switch.
Republican region. By the 1980s, the party begins to resemble the GOP we are familiar with today. Republicans elect Ronald Reagan, who promises to fight for business interests, lower taxes, and traditional
Ronald Reagan was an avowed racist. Even though he was the governor of California, he might as well have been a governor of Mississippi.
family values. As the 21st century begins, America is going through a major demographic shift in the form of Hispanic immigration, both legal and illegal. Democrats and business elites tend to support reforming immigration laws so that the over 10 million unauthorized immigrants in the US would get legal status. On the Republican side, tough on immigration policies and rhetoric became popular. But this ends up costing the Republicans when, in 2012, Mitt Romney loses his bid for the presidency. He gets blown out among Hispanic voters. Exit polls showed that 71% of them voted for Barack Obama. So the Republican Party starts to look more like a party for white voters in an increasingly non-white country. Given these demographic trends, Republican leaders worry that if they keep losing Hispanic voters by that much, they'll lose their chances of ever winning the presidency. So in
Unfortunately, that changed because the majority of white, Latino, Hispanic men started voting for Donald Trump, even though he said what he was going to do to them. But yet, they drank the MAGA Kool-Aid.
2013, some key Republicans in the Senate, including the rising star Marco Rubio, collaborate with Democrats on an immigration reform bill that would give unauthorized immigrants a path to legal status. But there's a huge backlash from the Republican Party's predominantly white base, which views the bill as amnesty for immigrants who broke the rules. This exacerbates the GOP voters' mistrust in their own party leaders, a mistrust that has already been growing for some time. And that makes the political landscape of 2015 fertile ground for a figure like Donald Trump, an outsider businessman who wants to build a wall on the border of Mexico. Trump isn't a traditional conservative, but he appealed to the resentment and the mistrust of party leaders that
He appealed to the resentment and mistrust, not only the party leaders, but also white people, and he appealed to their racial animus. It was not that Donald Trump was qualified, not because of his policy, but it was because of racial animus and mistrust and resentment.
Republican primary voters had, as well as the strong opposition to growing immigration trends. And even though he was loathed by party leaders, he won enough support in the primaries to become the GOP nominee for president. So now the Republican Party is once again at a major crossroads as it tries to meet the political challenges of the 21st century. It's up to Republican voters and leaders to decide just what they want their party to be.
Okay, family, I just wanted to, like I said, I wanted to bring some clarity and some truth about the history of the Republican Party. Because white conservatives and even black conservatives, they like to push the ugly history of the Democratic Party, but they don't want to talk about the ugly history of the Republican Party. I also want to add some other information, which the narrative already did not discuss. Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican, he withdrew the remaining federal troops during Reconstruction. They don't talk about that. It was the 1877 compromise. Some of you history buffs may know about that. In exchange for the removing the troops, Democrats dropped their objections and allowed Rutherford B. Hayes to be the president. You get that? Hayes agreed to end military oversight and restore home life to southern states, which meant black people lost their rights to vote and ushered in Jim Crow, black code laws, and hell for black people. And it restored home rule to southern states, returning political control to white southern Democrats. Did you get that? It was a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, who ushered in Jim Crow, black cause, Ku Klux Klan. It was a Republican. But they don't tell you about that. This withdrawal ended the Reconstruction era, consequently ending any rights black people had after slavery. Rutherford B. Hayes was the architect. And let me talk about a little bit about Lincoln, because they always like to say the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. Okay, let's be clear. Lincoln was a white supremacist. If you do your research, he did not believe that black people and white people were equal. In fact, he wanted to colonize black people to Liberia. Okay, and let me also say this: the reason that black people supported the Republican Party because they associated their freedom to Lincoln and the Republican Party. But many of them were not knowledgeable. There were no social media, and many of them were illiterate. But they knew Lincoln was the president, so they associated their freedom with him. But the fact of the matter is, Lincoln could care less about slavery. In fact, he said if he could maintain the Union and maintain slavery, would. You can look this up with a simple Google search. Okay? It's not rocket science. And let me also say this: systemic disenfranchisement. Black people who had briefly enjoyed political representation were rapidly pushed out of the democratic process. Southern states achieved this through restrictive measures like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, effectively erasing black political power by the early 1900s. And again, the rise of old Jim Crow. Without federal oversight to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, the South instituted Jim Crow laws. These state and local statutes enforce strict racial segregation across all public spaces, including schools, transportation, restrooms, and restaurants. You get that? And of course, the Ku Klux Klan, terror, violence, economic oppression. The withdrawal of troops emboldened white supremacist vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klans. Black citizens faced rampant intimidation, lynchings, and deadly race riots. And the Republican Party allowed it to happen. And as you heard earlier in the video, they were no longer concerned about the rights of black people. And one other thing I'm going to mention before I get off of here, there was a lily white movement within the Republican Party who pushed blacks out of the Republican Party. But you don't hear white conservatives nor black conservatives talk about that. If you doubt what I'm saying, do a Google search. So listen, I just want to give a brief history about the ugly history of the. And please, if you have an opportunity, do your own research. But I would also like for you to subscribe to the channel, share the video, and check out my other videos where I deal with other political and social issues. I'm going to go ahead and end with prayer. Again, Lord, I thank you for this platform, and I pray that this information was very informative, and I pray, Lord, that people become vigilant and do their own research. This I pray in Jesus' name. In the meantime, stay up and stay informed. God bless you.